here, and as I'm speaking, this is a great time for you to silence your phones or to make sure that they are silent. I am going to be very brief. It is just so exciting to be working with the World Affairs Forum again, and I see so many of my colleagues from the old World Affairs Forums that we had either at the Yacht House, Yacht Club, or here, so welcome. You're in for an exciting night tonight, and with that, I am going to step aside and take it from here.
Can you hear me though? All right, good evening everybody. My name is Megan Torrey. Okay. Lawazi's going to help me out here. Okay, great. Recording better now. Ooh. So, I'm Megan Torrey. I'm the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's a pleasure to be here with everybody tonight. Many of you may know or may not know that the World Affairs Forum and the World Affairs Council of Connecticut joined forces a few years ago. And so now we are all working together. I want to see a show of hands. Who is a current, or who was a member of the World Affairs Forum? Fantastic. I hope you're also now members of the World Affairs Council. We are now in full force here back in Fairfield County, and we have a lot of exciting things coming up for you. Same mission, same global engagement. You know, if you care about the world, we are the place for you. And I do want to shout out a few people in the room. Kay Maxwell is here. You may know that she ran the World Affairs Forum for many years, and it's such an honor to have her in the room, and I'm so happy to see her tonight. And we have some board members with us here tonight: Jim Connor, Jean Rostoff, Maudie Long, and my fellow, and your fellow board member, Adam Wood, who helped organize tonight. So we are going to co-moderate, and let's get started. I want to throw it over to Adam.
Great, thanks, Megan. So I'm so honored to have the privilege to introduce my friend and fellow Georgetown Hoya tonight, Mickey Bergman. Mickey is the author of the book In the Shadows, where he discusses his experiences negotiating the release of hostages and people unlawfully imprisoned in some of the most restrictive places on Earth. He is the CEO of Global Reach and a professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, where he teaches about emotional intelligence in international relations. He's managed relationships and private diplomacy efforts in North Korea, Cuba, Myanmar, Russia, the Middle East, Venezuela, and Africa. He's advocated for numerous political prisoners and hostages. There's honestly too many to list, but I just wanted to name a few. Paul Whelan and Brittney Griner from Russia, Danny Fenster from Myanmar, Otto Warmbier and Kenneth Bai from North Korea, Shizhu Wang and Robert Levinson from Iran, and so many more. He's twice been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, once in 2019 and once in 2023, alongside former Governor Bill Richardson. And he was recently honored with the 2023 James Foley Legacy Foundation American Hostage Freedom Award, and serves on the Center for Strategic and International Studies Commission on hostage taking and wrongful detention. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're honored to have you here. And Mickey, I hope you can begin today's conversation with just giving us a little bit of background on your work and the mission of Global Reach.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I have to say something about the Nobel Prize nomination. You know, when it's award season, right? Golden Globes, when somebody's calling, oh, this is Mickey's second nomination and 0 wins. Just to put it, you know, in perspective. No, thank you so much for being here. And I'll start a little bit on Global Reach. So we are a non-government, a non-for-profit organization. We work on behalf of families at their request at absolutely no cost to them. We raise our funds elsewhere for that, not from governments, but from private donors. And we do that in order to try and help those families get their loved ones back home. And some of them are hostages, some of them are political prisoners or wrongfully detained. That's the legal frame, the legal term for it in the US. And the way we do that is that we actually engage with the captors. Now, there's a lot of organizations, not a lot, but there's some organizations in our field that do advocacy on the Hill, which we also help do. They do advocacy with the administration, but very, very few actually go and meet with those, with the captors. I got into this about 20 to 18 years ago with Governor Bill Richardson, who roped me into this in Sudan for the first time in 2006. And I learned from him how you actually are able to be not government, so you don't have the authority of government, but you use relationship and personal connections that you build and emotional leverage with people in order to sometimes be able to solve the problem, like we did with Danny Fenster, who's a journalist, a Jewish journalist from Detroit, who was held in Myanmar. And we were able to create in a very short time a bond, an emotional bond. It was by design between Governor Richardson and the military leader of the head of the junta in Myanmar, and on the spot, able to convince him to give us Danny Fenster, even though he did it a week later, but to make the decision. So sometimes we're able to do that, and then we can bring the people home. But most of the time, we have to communicate with those governments, and as you can imagine, most of those governments don't have good relationship with the United States. Either they don't talk at all, or they talk, but they're limited in what they can actually communicate. And we're able, because we're not government, to actually focus and laser focus on the issue of the prisoners on a humanitarian level, and be able to refine and define what a solution looks like, and if it's feasible. And those solutions, by the way, are never pretty. But if it's at least half feasible, then try to convince our own government to come and do it. So we negotiate not only with the captors, we negotiate with our own government. It's a whole slew of complicated stakeholders through this, but that's kind of how we work and what we do. When Governor Richardson passed away over a year and a half ago, Steve Menzies, who was a businessman, American businessman from Nebraska, he was working with myself and Governor Richardson for quite a while during the pandemic when we couldn't fly. There were no commercial flights to all of these places to negotiate, and we need to do in-person negotiations. He basically said, "Oh, you can use my plane, but I'm coming with you." So Steve Menzies came with the governor and me to Venezuela in the middle of the pandemic, to Myanmar, to Russia, to all of these places, several times to Russia, to bring back Americans. After the governor passed away, he grabbed me at the funeral and said, "We need to keep that work going." And he says, "I'm going to be an anchor funder for this. Build me an organization of how we can do this, and we can actually do this bigger and better." So we took what I learned from Richardson and that center, and we built an infrastructure around it that is actually bigger, and that was the birth of Global Reach, and that's, in short, what we do. I'll just say one more thing. We're currently with 26 cases, so the workload keeps increasing, unfortunately for us. But as you probably saw in the news, the returns are also accelerating. Like, we're starting to get people back in a pretty good rate right now, which is hopefully continues.
Thank you so much, Mickey. And we are going to go to audience questions. So as we talk, I want you to think of your questions, and I want you to also think about getting his book after, because it's a fascinating book, and I really think it's worth a great read. So the world has been paying attention to what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And as an Israeli American who's been deeply involved in advising and representing families of the Israeli hostages, I imagine the last year and a half has been pretty incredibly hard. Can you talk a little bit about your involvement in the efforts to bring the Israeli hostages home and provide an overview? And we know that with the ceasefire that we're seeing this a lot. More.
Yeah, no, thank you. And today obviously is a really, really difficult day in this. Unfortunately, we knew that this day is coming. We also knew the emotional implosion that will happen when it comes, because even though, obviously I'm talking about the Bibas family, even though we knew with good certainty that they have unfortunately were killed, we knew that the moment that the remains come back is a moment in which the deal can be blown up just because of emotion. And we're seeing the trauma now in Israel. But so I'll get to that in a second, but I want to kind of go back. And I found out that it's important for me to say what I'm about to say before we talk about Gaza. It's important to recognize within a room like this, because it brings so many emotions. October 7th was traumatic to all of us. Traumatic to Israelis, traumatic to American Jews, traumatic to Palestinians, traumatic to Palestinian Americans, traumatic to supporters of Israel in the US, traumatic to supporters of Palestinian and Palestinian statehood in the US. And when we suffer such trauma, and that was a big trauma, our brains work a little bit differently and they react differently. And so I always find it extremely important that as we start a conversation, and I'll tell you the story of the negotiations in a minute, is to make sure that we're sending the right intentions. Because I'm making an assumption here, I hope it's right. Everybody in this room wants hostages back home, don't want civilians, innocent people to die, and we want to figure out a way out of this mess. We might disagree vehemently of how to do it, but as long as we accept our basic intentions, that's what we do, we can argue as much as we want, but we should never question the intentions. And that's just important to set, because that helps us a little bit reduce the traumatic effect and the triggers that happen. So with that, I'll tell you, I woke up October 7th in my house in Arlington, Virginia, same way that most of you woke up here, with news breaking. It was already a few hours into this in Israel. My first few hours were extremely traumatic for me because I was glued to my TV. I have Israeli television online, and so I look at that, and I was seeing all the reinforcements coming in, driving into the borders there, and these were the same special units in the military that I served with. Now, it's not the same people, I'm old, but it's the same thing. And for the first time in my life since experiencing, and I served for 6 years, I smelled it. I was in Virginia and I was smelling it. I smelled it, I felt it. In fact, I knew the voices, I knew what's happening there. And I looked at it and I had that sense of like, oh my God, these people are about to die. And there was nothing I can do to stop it. And that was very traumatic. And I felt for the first time again that was the first sign that I've ever had of a real PTSD might be emerging from all of my combat experience. And then a phone call came into my cell phone, and it was Leah Goldin. Leah Goldin is the mother of Hadar Goldin, who's a soldier that was killed an hour after a ceasefire in Gaza took effect in 2014. So this is like more than 10 years ago. He was killed and his body was taken by Hamas. And I know Leah because I've been working with her to try and retrieve the remains of her son to bring it to bear. He's still there. He is in phase 3 of this agreement. And she calls me and she said, Mickey, you know how for 10 years nobody was listening to me? Well, guess what? Everybody's calling me now. And we didn't know there were hostages, the term was missing at that point. And she said, we immediately established a call center and everybody's like getting in information, but Mickey, they're asking me for my help. Can I refer them to you? And I said, of course. And immediately I snapped out of my own cycle of looking at the news and sprung into work, which is one of the best remedies you can do in avoidance. But that was what I was doing. Within a day, ended up with about 67 of families of missing Israelis that asked for our help. And we stepped into what we call the theory of return. And the theory of return is the first thing we do when we take a case. We have to come up with the story, the narrative, the script of the shortest pathway of how you get somebody back home. And in this case, we had a few assumptions. The first one, Israel and Hamas don't communicate directly. Therefore, whatever agreement has to happen has to be mediated. Now, I know that because back in 2007, 2008, I was a mediator with Richardson between Hamas and Israel over a kidnapped soldier, Gilad Shalit, back then. So we figured out it needs to be mediated. That's number one. Number two, there are 4 governments in the Middle East that can influence Hamas. None of them can control Hamas. It's important to understand that. None of them can control Hamas. It's a very proud, independent Palestinian program. But 4 governments can actually influence them, and that is Turkey, Iran, Egypt, and Qatar. As most of you can imagine, none of them have an interest in helping Israel, period. But 2 of them, Egypt and Qatar, have an absolute interest in helping the United States. Therefore, our theory of return very quickly was, number 1, we had to make this an American story. We had to make it an American priority at the presidential level. Because if it's an American story, then the Qataris can go to Hamas and say, you know, we know you have a fight with Israel, but the Americans need us to solve the hostage issue. Give us a proposition, a proposal. What can we do? And if that proposal that they solicit is, again, half decent, or at least not existentially threatening the state of Israel, then it would be the work of the administration, the US administration, to convince and to provide the Israeli government every comfort that they can in order to accept and implement that. That was the theory of return. Pretty simple. Of course, it never ends up being that simple, but that was the theory of return that we came up with, and we went to work with it. And so immediately with Leah Goldin, when they did a call center, we asked them, give us every single link to the United States of every missing Israeli. Citizens, relatives of citizens, green card holders, hostages that used to study, were students in American institutions, families, everything that we could find, because we needed to get a good, solid number and a body of this in order to make sure that it's visibly an American story, an American proposition. When it came to our White House, we didn't need to do much, because President Biden, what you saw of him on October 7th was not a political calculation. It was in his DNA. Like, he was hurting on this one and he wanted to respond to that. And so the fact that he physically met with the families very quickly, within 5 days, he had a meeting with the families of the Americans that are being held. Okay, that was what we needed. That was the proof to show this is an American priority. Sad comment, because we work with families all over the world, I had to explain to those Israeli families how different it is that the President of the United States meets with them within 5 days, because I have families of Americans who are held in other countries, sometimes 8, 7, 11 years, never get a phone call from the White House. That was very quick. The Qataris took that, and they took it to Hamas, and they said they did something more than what we thought they would do. They said, before we even talk about the proposal or about a deal, we need you to provide a proof of concept. We need to prove to the Americans that this channel can work. And they got Hamas to release 2 women from the Chicago area for nothing in return. That was the proof of concept. The Israelis, by the way, had no idea that it was coming. They got a note in the last couple of hours before that, and then they flew them back in. But that was a proof of concept. And once that worked, there was a solicitation of a proposal. And as I mentioned before, in general, those proposals are never good. I'm trying to find the words that are not terrible for online viewers, but they stink. They always stink. They're not just. But it's a responsibility that we have in order to get people home. And so when the proposal came, the initial proposal came, sorry, I'm telling you a little bit long, so you can cut me off. When the initial proposal came, we had to work with the families of the hostages in order to convince the Israeli government to accept it. It wasn't a shoo-in. It wasn't an easy thing. Because again, the cost to Israel, the cost that was asked in return for these hostages was really high. And I went to Israel and I sat with a lot of the families. I met them. I know now a lot of people know all the stories of the survivors from the kibbutzim and from the music festival. That was still really, really fresh, and it was the first time I heard it from the people themselves, and horror stories that I basically had to take in and bury inside, because if they stayed here, I would not be functional. And we managed to come up with the forum in Israel, the Forum of Families in Israel, with a strategy, and was able to get the Israeli government to accept the initial deal. And immediately when that happened, I hopped from Tel Aviv to Doha. Ironically, I had to hop through Russia because we had negotiations over there, and there was no direct flight, so hey, why not go through Russia? But I ended up in Doha for the implementation of the first deal. That was November of a year plus ago. And here's something that people don't recognize or don't know. Even when there's an agreement, in order to get the sides into the agreement, the mediators use something called constructive ambiguity, which is DC talk to double talk. And it's because you need to make sure that each side feels that they're getting what they're getting in order to get them to the table. And you count on the fact that in the last moment, they will realize that there are actual gaps, but they'll have so much appetite that you can squeeze them together and get it done at the finish line. Classic negotiation strategy. That was the case in those deals, the current one and the one back in November of a year plus ago, which means that every single day, if you remember it, every day, 10 hostages were supposed to be released. And every day, Hamas didn't show up with what Israel expected. Israel did not show up with what Hamas expected. And they were duking it up, and it was almost collapsing every single day. Now, I'm not a formal diplomat. I don't sit in the room. I was outside of the room where there were two rooms. There was the Israelis, Americans, and Hamas.
This is in Qatar?
In Qatar, yeah. The Israeli Americans and Qataris sitting in one room, and then the Qataris and Hamas sitting in the other room. And I'm getting phone calls from all three parties, except for the Americans, the Israelis, Hamas, and Qatar. And those phone calls are to test with us informally how far they can push the envelope without the other side walking. Why? Because if they do that on the table, on the formal table, and they push too far, deal is off. So I would get all these things, and I was not the only one, by the way. There were a bunch of us there doing it, and everybody's on phone calls and communicating all around. And it was a clear formula from the Israeli side. Israel can stomach the wrong categories, different priorities, as long as Hamas shows up with 10. Every day, Israel will stomach it. As soon as they show up with less than 10, Israel walks away. And the deal lasted in the extensions of it for about 4 days, and then Hamas showed up with 7. And I tried everything I could to try and convince the Israelis to take the 7 and then walk away. But it was a principle, and they walked away without those 7. Unfortunately, none of those 7 have survived since. And I left the country to come back here because I knew fighting will ensue. We have about a couple of weeks, at least, until we go back. I'll try and accelerate because I know I'm taking a long time, but it's obviously it's an emotional story in this. But 10 days after, I got a phone call from members of the Israeli mission. Not officially the mission, but members, individuals in it, telling me, look, the Prime Minister is not sending us back. And we think that we need to negotiate. Can you go back to Doha, and we'll give you a list of the questions that we want to have. We need to understand what is on the table so we can try and convince the Prime Minister to send the head of the Mossad back to negotiations. And I did that, but that is also why I can tell you that as of December, a year plus ago, the 3-stage proposal deal that is now being implemented was available. I communicated it to the Israelis. 2 differences between what was then and what is now. We had more hostages alive, and there was less on the list of what Israel had to do in order to get it done, because Israel was just not as deep into Gaza as it was when this deal started. And we tried everything we could to try and convince the Israelis to join this and to do this, because it's the best that can be. I'll tell you, there's 2 truths about hostage negotiations that I learned over 18 years. Number 1, the deals never get better. We tell ourselves stories, we spin, they never get better. And second is that time is the worst for the hostages.
So thank you for that insight. And I just want to transition to, you've been in the center of so many contentious and high-profile hostage relief situations. And I wanted to talk a little bit, for you to talk a little bit about Russia and your experience there with negotiations. But I just want to take a brief moment to acknowledge someone who joined us, the Mayor Caroline Simmons. You want to, everyone want to welcome her, but we're so glad she joined us with her family here tonight. So thank you. But with that, I'll pivot over to, we'd love to hear from you about those negotiations in Russia, some of the high-profile cases that you've been involved with. Share with us your insights about Russia.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll start from the past, and I'll try and get to where we are now, because it's fascinating to see this as it unfolds. This current historical round with Russia started with Paul Whelan, who was taken. And for those of you who remember, in terms of the timeline, Paul Whelan was taken about the time that Marina Butina was captured in the US. She is a Russian spy that was embedded here in a bunch of organizations, the NRA and others. And it was clear, in terms of, even though nobody says it, it was clear that that was kind of the trade that was on the table. And by the time we spoke with the ambassador, the Russian ambassador to the US, Antonov, he since then left, who, by the way, is in my business, I have to meet with a lot of people that are responsible for really terrible things. But one of the things that you find when you meet with people is that people are actually complicated. And there's very few people who are pure evil. Actually, I don't know many of them. There's good and evil in all of us, and different circumstances it brings it up in different ways. Antonov is a hysterically funny guy, like with a dry sense of humor, like good old Russian sense of humor, and he would crack me up. Like, I don't have a poker face, I just laugh on this. But with him, and we developed a good relationship and understanding what it needs to be said, he's a good old diplomat. He used to be the deputy minister of defense in Russia before he was the ambassador here. And he looked at us and he says, yeah, Marina Butina, the DOJ gave her 18 months and 12 have been served already. So she has 6 more months here. Yeah, she can sit in prison. That's fine. She'll come back to us. In other ways saying, you guys are stupid. You didn't leverage her to get Paul Whelan, so we're going to get her. We're patient. She'll get released. We'll get something else for Paul Whelan. And we started working with them on that and trying to figure out, on the other side, and they pointed out to us, as soon as we complained about Paul Whelan's situation, they brought up to us a case of a guy, a Russian prisoner in the US named Konstantin Yaroshenko. He's a drug pilot that was caught in Africa, in West Africa and Liberia with his plane. Had nothing to do with the US, except that when he was detained, he talked up with his captors in Liberia how he's good friends personal friends of Putin, thinking it would get him out of jail there, but what it got him is an extradition to the US, and he got 20 years sentencing because we claimed that some of the drugs would have ended up in the US. And just to give you a flavor of it, the Russians were saying, look, the Liberians, punched his teeth out, and he doesn't, his teeth are hurting, and nobody's sending him a dentist into the prison. So don't complain to us that Paul Whelan doesn't have a health care when you don't take care of your prisoners here. And we're not there to punch, we're there to try and get, so it's okay. Hey, we don't know about it. Do you happen to have any information? Of course, he had pre-printed for us all of his requests and all that stuff. And we took it and we said, look, we'll work in trying to get a dentist to see Yaroshenko. And he says, if you do that, I can assure you there will be reciprocity. So again, not a deal. It's not a tit for tat, but reciprocal actions. And we had to go, by the way, this is during the first Trump administration, we went all the way to Attorney General Barr. We met with him in order to convince him to let us pay for a dentist to go into Danbury here in Connecticut to see Konstantin Yaroshenko We did that. Within 6 days, Paul Whelan got a health check outside of the prison. So we proved the concept of this kind of reciprocal, and we started trying to do a little bit more. Then a pandemic hit. And at that point, we went to the Russians and said, okay, let's cut it because we don't want the Russian to die here. You don't want the American to die there out of pandemic. Can we get it done? And they said, yeah, very simple. If you do a gesture, a medical gesture and release of Yaroshenko, we will reciprocate. We brought it to the White House. The White House didn't want to hear about it. What did the Russians do? They arrested Trevor Reed. I know there's a lot of criticism of my work, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in the Q&A, that all I do when I do these deals or convince everybody to do these deals, I'm incentivizing the taking of more Americans. Valid, absolutely valid criticism. I can argue that it's also the opposite. When we avoid making the deals, we're putting more Americans at risk, and Russia is one of my examples. So Trevor Reed, Marine, former Marine, presidential guard at Camp David, was taken in Russia. We went back to negotiating. At that point, they told us, the Russians said, yeah, we'll give you Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan in return for Konstantin Yaroshenko and Viktor Bout. Viktor Bout is an arms dealer, everybody knows, because he ended up being released for Brittney Griner. We could have gotten that before Brittney was taken. We could have avoided the whole thing. Had we taken it, this was, at that point, it was the Biden administration early. They didn't want to hear anything about it. We went back to the Russians, and I told the Russians, don't send me to the White House with something I can't win. Don't give me Viktor Bout. Give me somebody else. And they had another guy. Zelesnov, he was in North Carolina for 27 years, charged for a credit fraud. Stole billions of dollars from Americans. Didn't kill anybody. That I could win with. Went to the White House, couldn't get anywhere. Again, at the time, pandemic, it's all really, really bad. Things in Ukraine are getting hot. Trevor Reed is coughing blood. And we get invited into Moscow. I kid you not, we were there February 24th at the Red Square when Putin announced the invasion into Ukraine. That's when we were negotiating over this. And the Russians basically said, Viktor Bout and Yaroshenko for Trevor Reed and Paul Whelan. Or if you want to, because Trevor Reed is sick, we'll just do Yaroshenko for Trevor Reed. That's how Paul Whelan was left behind the first time. I'm cutting it short, but it happened again with Brittney Griner. And it happened again with in Taylor Dudley that we got out afterwards by ourselves. There's been a whole slew of this. The heart of this with the Russians is that they believe in reciprocity and they believe in symmetry. They don't want to feel like you're coming to the table as if you're in a power position. They want to be equal to you. That's if you think of Putin's agenda, like his objective is to put back Soviet Union for that matter, but Russia toe-to-toe with the US. And as long as you're playing that game, you can get results. I'll jump into now and where we're at because we had another transition. Again, this was Trump to Biden, now back to Trump. We have 26 Americans still held in Russia. A lot of them are dual citizens and are dissidents locally, so they're really hard to get because they're anti-Putin Russians. But we're working on the case of 4 who are clearly wrongfully detained. We believe that they will come back home soon. Some of them might trickle in the way that we saw in the last couple of weeks with Mark Fogel and others as measures of trust building as negotiations are taking place. But the big chunk of them are going to come back on the side of a ceasefire agreement over Ukraine. So for President Trump, it will not be an exchange, which he used to criticize a lot, even though he did it himself, but it's just the politics of it. It will be a supplement to a ceasefire agreement over Ukraine. There will be a term that we use for this, a repatriation, a mutual repatriation of nationals. Again, not an exchange of prisoners, but that kind of thing. So I'm hopeful that they'll come home within a few months.
So I think we're going to go to audience questions soon. But as you were talking, we didn't prepare this question, but it was around December 8th when Bashar al-Assad's regime fell. I don't know if you're working on this case, but do you know, or can you update us on Austin Tice?
To some extent, and I need to be very careful with this. So we worked with the Tice family back when he was initially taken. They asked for our help. That was with Richardson. And we had a whole effort when we tried to, this was early in the war in Syria. We identified a Syrian diplomat, a high-level Syrian diplomat that we wanted to turn in return for information about Austin. We were able to turn the diplomat, but he came flat on information, so we couldn't. We ended up in a dead end with that. Deborah, Tice, and Mark, they work non-stop on this, and they will work with anybody that can provide information. And as the Biden administration came to an end, it started a whole flurry of, oh, we know he's alive, we have all this evidence. I have no evidence to the contrary, but I also don't have any evidence, any leads from our work that we found that are sufficient enough to believe that there is a lead there. There's something we can investigate. And when Syria fell, everybody went into Syria. All the American, the special presidential envoy on hostage affairs basically based himself in Lebanon and was going in and out of Syria. A lot of the NGO community went in, a lot of investigation, stuff like that. Unfortunately, it fell short. We couldn't find him, nobody. We were not in on that one. Couldn't find evidence of him being alive, couldn't find evidence of him being killed. There are several options on this. There are scenarios in which he's alive, in which he is being held and transferred as the Syrian regime fell. There are still high-level members of that regime that are hiding in Russian bases in Syria. It is possible that he's been taken as an insurance policy for them. The problem with that is that if that was the case, we would have heard some communications over this. Another option, that he was taken because the area where he was last seen, that was 2015. That's the last lead that exists that I know of, and I don't have a security clearance, by the way. So that was an area that was controlled by Iranian forces, and there was a big battle, and they lost that area. It is possible that he was taken back to Iran, but again, I worked with the Iranians. We had several releases then. It is such a high rewards for them. So for them not to articulate that they have him and play that card, especially in the last few months when they're getting threats and hits, doesn't add up. It is possible, sorry, I'm sorry to be a downer on this one. You ask me short questions and I have stories and everything, but that's the nature of it. There was a specific battle in Syria in which there was a report in which he used that battle and escaped successfully, and then was recaptured. And that's when we lost track, or everybody, the track went cold on this. In a battle like that, the villagers don't know who's who. They would know who's Austin Tice, who's not Austin Tice. And so that's where the trail you can use the trail, and there are ways to try and reinvestigate it, and there's a lot of efforts on this, and we're just currently trying to figure out if there's something that we can do to help, just to make sure that we bring it to a close, hopefully with a sign of life, but even if it's any closure that you can bring to the family. Bob Levinson, which you mentioned, he was killed in Iran more than a decade ago, but the family still doesn't have like his watch or any closure from that perspective. The family accepted it because there was enough evidence to show them, but that's not enough. We still need to bring, like, Jim Foley executed publicly. His body is still in Syria. Kyla Mueller, her body is still in Syria. Satlov, his body is still in Syria. Kasich, all of the ISIS things. We're trying to figure out if we can find them somehow. And we know we're looking for bodies, for remains after all these years, but for the families, like we need to bring them back home.
So I think this is a good time to pivot to audience questions, but I just want to raise sort of what came out in your answer there. Maybe as you answer some of the audience questions, you can share with us some of the tactics, because not everyone knows exactly the work that you do, which is a combination of intelligence gathering, using your network, and negotiating tactics, obviously, but it's a blend of different things. And maybe in answering the audience questions, you can kind of take us through some of those tactics. But any questions from the audience? Just raise your hand
I
if you have a
bumped
question.
everybody down.
Here we go. We got a question over here. Yeah.
In essence, I think of you more as a mediator between two rivalry parties. My question is where's the diplomats in all this? I mean, that's supposed to be the entree to other nations, and there should be connections there, but it's government against government. I get the feeling governments prefer this method, with you being the mediator or your group, because you could play both sides. And it's really a question. So
Yeah, no, thank you. And you're right to some extent. Let me give you an example on this. So, look, if an American is held in North Korea, the Americans don't talk to North Korea. You have to step in and do something like that. Even the junta in Myanmar, when they took over and deposed Aung San Suu Kyi, the military government over there, when they held Danny Fenster, there is a robust U.S. embassy in Yangon, still is. But they don't talk to the government. And if you don't talk to the government who holds an American, how are you going to get him home? So there's, I have a whole thing about how, we're treating diplomacy opposite of what it's supposed to be. When there's a crisis, we actually need to engage, not disengage. That's the whole point of it. Having said that, even the governments that we do talk to, the Americans and the Russians, they talk to each other. Now imagine we decide, the Russians and the Americans decide, we're going to go and sit and we're going to talk about the prisoners. And we have Adam here, the Russian, Megan here, the American, and we're sitting around the table. We're saying, okay, we're coming to talk about the prisoners. Diplomats, before the first word is said, the weight of the war in Ukraine, the weight of nuclear instability, and all of these issues are making it impossible to keep the conversation insulated to the humanitarian issue of prisoners. We only have one mandate from the families. And we have certainly no authority from government. And so when we go in, they can talk to us about Ukraine. And trust me, every time you go to meet in Russia, the meetings are typically about 8 hours long. And the first 4 hours, you're lectured of how the world runs. And if I were a diplomat, I would have to protest and walk away and say, no, this is not. I'm not. I love this. This is great for me because I'm hearing the narrative the way it's been articulated by leadership in Russia. I don't have to agree with that narrative. But I understand, once I understand how they think of this, I can find the ways of what to do. So I stick with it and I hear the conversations and I'm able to, so they can talk to me about all these things. They talk to me about Ukraine, they talk about nuclear instability, they talk to me about all the things that we are in charge of because we're the source of all evil in the world. And I let it, I let it slide. I take what I need out of it. And then we come back to the only thing that we have a mandate to talk about, and that is the prisoners. And that makes us, it makes my life, I don't envy the diplomats, because when they look at something like that, they have so many complex interests that they need to balance. I only have one. So my life is simpler that way. It's not because we're better than them. We're not. It's just that we have a focus mandate that allows us to distill the specifics of it, and that's different. But to your last comment, trust me, governments don't prefer to use us.
really,
They hate us. In a general thing, they never want us involved because we're the ones that are skewing the pure policy that they came up with. and strategy, because we're the annoying people who make it impossible to ignore the human beings in the middle of it. And it's, sorry, just not saying, but that's the US government typically hates us. The foreign government who holds the captors, if they have a direct contact with the US government, trust me, they put us in the back burner. I can tell you a story about Venezuela, how it comes, we're going up and down, up and down, up and down the code. Every time they have direct contact, suddenly we're on the back burner. Every time they call us to put us in the front burner, we know that something went wrong in the official negotiations. They see us, we're an asset for them. We're able to hear them, to listen to them and communicate what they want. And in most cases, help them get the deal that they want, which also we want. So that's, sorry, you had a...
One last question. So has your group ever been in a position where a foreign entity made you the go-between for financial reasons? For getting money out of, say, America? And you become the messenger.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I can tell you that, and that's interesting because there's a transition in the mindset right now on this. Short answer, no. We were never asked for a facilitation of ransom or anything like that when it comes to hostages, because that's not what, we won't do that. It's illegal in this country, and it's not the mindset of how we work. There are groups that work with that and are able to do it. We were asked one time by the FBI, that was back in 2017, I think. They said, oh, we have a real ransom proposition to get an American home. Would your group be willing to facilitate that? And I said, where is my get out of jail free card? And the FBI said, no, you don't get one. I said, I can't do that. And you know, there are other ways for them to facilitate that. But the other part of your question, or maybe you intended or not, maybe not, there are governments who are looking for financial concessions from the US in return for that. And that's typically special licenses on sanctions. And traditionally, the US never concedes on financial or policy, and that includes sanctions, in return for prisoners. That might be changing right now, because there was so much criticism of the exchanges of prisoners to prisoners. And if you can't do that, then how are you going to get, there's always a price to pay. And so for those of us who are looking at the Venezuela space, Rick Grenell went to Venezuela, by the way, in a very smart way, and got 6 Americans back home within a week of this administration. The reason why he got it was because he flew on an American Air Force plane into Caracas. Back, even when the Americans were negotiating with the Venezuelans over prisoners and everything else, they would always chart a plane. This is an American flag plane landing in Caracas. So despite the rhetoric that we don't see Maduro as a legitimate leader, this was a clear message for Maduro domestically: we accept your sovereignty. That meant to him a lot. So much that he was willing to give 6 Americans. Now he still has a whole bunch of other Americans, so he has a stockpile there. But that was also a message from the current Trump administration saying Trump 1 is not necessarily Trump 2. This is not about regime change the way it was. The people are different, the influences are different. This is much more of a transactional, like, you have resources, we want to use them, we can make a deal together, and therefore there is, even though there was no Venezuelan prisoners returned in return for the Americans, there has been some arrangements around sanction relief or at least special licenses around the oil field. So your question is very pointed because it's shifting right now.
Hi, thank you. I am enjoying this talk. I'm curious, when that horrible thing happens and someone is taken prisoner, how does the family find you, and how many other organizations, NGOs in the U.S. do similar work that they might reach out to. When you were talking about being in a room between the three parties and there was lots of people there negotiating different points, I'm imagining each family may have had a different negotiator working for them.
So it's a great question. So we don't advertise. We don't go and chase cases. There are groups that do that. We don't. And I'll tell you why. Because when something like that happens to a family, give an example, the Wombier family. When Otto was taken, trust me, the Wombiers had no idea anything about North Korea. Suddenly, within a minute, they're in the middle of an international geopolitical crisis, and their son, his life is at stake. And they get bombarded, these families, with a lot of people coming to them, all with good intentions, almost none with experience in this, and everybody has advice on what to do. And as a family, you have a lot of misinformation, tons of partial information, and yet you feel that every single decision that you make or decision that you don't make will be the one that will get your son killed or will get him rescued. That is an unimaginable and intolerable burden on a family. So the first rule for us, we don't add to that. So we don't go after them. The way they hear about us, typically the first thing that they do is they go to the congressional representation, whether it's in-state or national. That congressional office, whether they have experience or not, they start to kind of look around, stuff like that. There's the government agencies that deal with it, and then they typically hear about us. And then they reach out, we do an intake, because, again, I can tell you, we get on average about 3-4 new cases every week. Most of them are not wrongful. Most of them are Americans who have done something wrong in another country and are not treated differently because they're Americans, but for their families, they're innocent. And those families are and we're very empathetic because their families are in terrible position. Mainly it happens in Mexico, by the way, drug-related Mexico. But if we're not careful and we take a case of somebody who actually did something wrong badly, we lose our credibility. And I can tell you, we had a case. I had a case in Nicaragua that you know, I said, "Oh, my husband has been taken political prisoner." He was caught in an act of pedophilia. Can't do that. I had a case in Thailand where a mother called this, her son was taken political prisoner. He murdered and chopped a person. It's not, and it's hard because it's like the due diligence, we don't have full information. We have partial misinformation. We use our experience to kind of to do the most we can. And the second part of your question, I can name the organizations that do this, beyond us. Foley Foundation. It was established by Diane Foley. Her son, Jim Foley, was an ISIS, was executed by ISIS, unfortunately, on television. She took all of that pain and turned it into a foundation. And that they do the intake with families. They kind of are the counter to the US government and saying their determination of who's wrongfully detained and who's not, and then they advocate for them. They have Hostage US, which is an organization of volunteers that help the families while their loved ones are in captivity. Legal volunteers, social workers, therapists, all of these things you won't imagine. When somebody's taken, he's the head of the household, the family doesn't have access to the bank accounts. The house deed, all of those things. American prisoners come back from captivity. Jason Rezaian came back from Iran after 7 years. You know what the first thing he got? A bill from the IRS for all the taxes he forgot to pay. Evan Gershowitz, the same thing. He talked about it. So Hostage US helps with that. With Global Reach, by the way, we support those two organizations financially. We give them multi-year grants because they do things that we don't. And they're the best in the field to do that, so we work very collaboratively with them. None of them negotiate the release or mediate the release of prisoners the way we do. And because we know our lane, we work very well together. There's hostage aid worldwide, which is an organization of former hostages that helps with advocacy and public advocacy. And sometimes they actually go in country, like they went into Syria and Chad, because the founder, Nizar, has these relationships and he went over there. And then there's a whole slew of lawyers and individuals that do this on behalf of families. They typically charge the families. And that for us is a red line. So if a family works with somebody like that, we try to say, we'll work with you, but we can't work with them, just because we believe that there's enough support in this. I have here Christy Cole, if you can raise your hand. Christy Cole is with us. She works with us in helping us both on strategy and the development of this. There's enough resources out there for this. So you don't need to charge families. PR firms that charge families. And they're not bad people, but they're doing it because they think it's mission. But again, that sense of at the worst time for the families, like we can rally up and make sure that we don't do that. So the ecosystem is quite large, but very, very few do the actual negotiations. And when they do, it's a one-off. We're actually the only institution, like organization, that is dedicated to that. There's the Sufan group that does a lot of intelligence gathering on behalf of families. There are quite a few, but it's a very small universe of that field.
I think there was another question here.
Hi, as you mentioned that there might be more of a transition to a transactional approach, that concerns me that it increases the scope of attractive targets that our enemies might be interested in. So it might actually increase the amount of hostages that are taken. What are your thoughts on that?
It concerns you and me both. Okay. I believe, look, I'm the one that believes that when an American is taken because they're American, or they're taken for another reason, but then they're treated differently because they're American, it is our responsibility to do everything we can to bring them home. It's also our responsibility to build deterrence. But deterrence can never be built on the backs of those who are rotting in prisons. And so we have to be able to make sure that first we bring people home, and when people are coming home, we actually turn around and make sure that the captors pay a price. I have a lot of people who don't know me enough will argue, oh yeah, he's just a tree hugger. He just wants to empathize with everybody, all the bad people, and get them what they want. That's my job. I do that. And then I sit on a commission at the Center for Strategic International Studies when we're looking about deterrence stuff. And I'm also the first one to say, look, when you deal with Hamas, I know this is, I'm fine with it going public, it's fine. Typically I say it more privately, but when you deal with Hamas and you sign a deal with Hamas, they're not worth the paper you're signing. I'm doing it because I need to save people. Once those people are saved, we need to turn around and make sure that they understand that there's a price to pay for doing this. And I'll give an example that one of the biggest, I mentioned that I was involved in the Gilad Shalit negotiations back in 2007, 2008. I didn't conclude it, it was concluded in 2011, but we set the parameters of it and the deal was basically the same deal, because as I told you, the deals never get better. 1,100 Palestinian prisoners were released for a single Israeli soldier. It was the only way to get him home. And it was the responsibility of Israel to get him home. And people criticize it because one of those 1,100 prisoners that were released was Yehia Sinwar, who orchestrated October 7th. Trust me, I'm getting hate mail for that for a long, long time. And I still stand by my advocacy for that deal, because the problem was not with the deal. The problem with what Israel didn't do after the deal concluded, because there were plenty of opportunities to bring him back to justice once he re-engaged in terror. along with a whole bunch of them, and only 47 of those 1,100 were actually brought back to justice in Israel. Israel used to be very famous for making sure that anybody that messes with an Israeli, even if they get what they want in the short term, has a target for the rest of their lives. That's deterrence. Now, I don't advocate for killing anybody, trust me. I served for 6 years. This is my pacifism comes out. I believe that violence just never solved the problem long term. Might feels like a good, short-term fix, but it just never solved the problem. That's my personal belief coming out of service of 6 years. Yet we could have captured them. We could have made sure, and I can tell Danny Fenster, who we brought back from Myanmar, it is now, 3 years ago? Yeah, 3 years ago. No, 4 years ago. 4 years ago. Oh, time flies. We brought him back home. I can tell you, to this date, Danny Fenster was never called into an FBI or any debriefing by the US government to ask him who has wronged him. Who are the guards who wronged him? Who are the judges? Who was the minister? Forget about sanctions. They don't do business with the US. Indict them in a US court. And yes, they don't accept jurisdiction. But if you're able to calculate every now and then, 1, 2, 3, grab them and bring them to justice here, now you're starting to put a dent in it.
So fascinating stories like this are in the shadows, what you wrote. They're really
Sorry, I talk a lot. Yeah.
Covering Myanmar, Cuba, Russia, Israel. Really fascinating talk. We're so thankful for your time here today, and we want to transition at this point to the book signing portion to allow enough times for folks to get a book and have them signed. And I'll turn it over to Megan.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we worked with Mickey over the summer on our World Now series, and it was the first one I was saying, God, I just hope this never ends, right? Because it's so fascinating and it's so human, and you see why he has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, because at the end of the day, it's about all of our human dignity. And we're lucky that we have someone in the world who's working to help those people imagine the great loss that the families of hostages are feeling. So thank you so much for what you do, Mickey. And please get a book, and we encourage you to engage in your world and join the World Affairs Council, and see you at another event soon. Thank you so much for joining us.